I was just thinking a little bit as Valerian was talking about in his prayer about Christ being our mediator, and we sang a song talking about our living hope, and we talked about his presence, the Lord's presence being with us. I thought that's kind of odd to do if Christ was still in the grave, would it not? We don't talk too much about someone's presence being with us, experiencing someone's presence. Well, maybe you do, I don't know. But for the most of us, we don't talk about that when we're visiting a graveside. We don't think about a living hope. In terms of, obviously if that person's known the Lord, we have that to look forward to. But tonight we're really going to focus in on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the reason I want to do that is because, first of all, we did a 3-part series. We started about 3-4 weeks ago talking about why do we have faith? What is faith? And we talked about that we have faith in something rather than just faith in and of itself. We talked about that. Then 2 weeks ago, we were talking about morality. We're talking about whether it's subjective or whether it's objective in nature. And this week, we're going to culminate the series talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I think the reason that is so foundational and it's important is because if you have a Bible or a Bible app or something like that, if you go check out Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 15 or 14 and 15, he talks about if Christ has not been raised from the dead, your faith is in vain. And I'm paraphrasing this, but you're wasting your time as Christians, because everything comes central and comes focused in on the resurrection. Did Jesus Christ rise from the dead? And obviously we would affirm that he did rise from the dead. But that's easy to affirm within these 4 walls. That's easy to affirm when there's other believers around. But when we take that message out to the world, oftentimes that's looked at with a lot of hesitation or a lot of critique. And so this evening, as we wrap things up, I just want to leave you with some final thoughts about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think why it's important, and as Christians, why we believe it, and why we should believe that. So why Jesus, the resurrected Jesus? Essentials apologetics, by the way. Apologetics, simply giving a reason for what we believe. We're not apologizing for what we believe, but rather just giving a reason for why. So we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction and talk about the one way that we could destroy Christianity. As we just mentioned a moment ago, one way that we could destroy it or one way that we could falsify it would be to find the body of Jesus. If we had the body of Jesus and we said he didn't rise from the dead, obviously that would falsify Christianity. It would. And we would have the body of Jesus and we could all go home and we could join another club and do something else. But we surely wouldn't call ourselves Christians if we found the body of Jesus, okay? So one way that we would falsify that is to find it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that this evening. 1 Corinthians 15, 16, 17, and 19 sort of jumbled in there a little bit, but proceeding chronologically. If the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. If we have hoped in Christ in this life, we are of all men and women most to be pitied. Those are Paul's words. And I think, they're pretty straightforward, saying that, listen, we talk about a living hope. We talk about Christ being raised from the dead. He's the mediator, and he has all these qualities, but you can't do that if you're still dead. You can't do that if you're still in the grave. So we'll explore that a little bit more this evening. The centrality of the resurrection. Like I mentioned, Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus was not raised, then Jesus is a liar. Anybody a little uncomfortable with that statement? Be honest. We don't like to put it in those terms, but if that's the truth, if he says, I'm going to die and 3 days later I'm going to rise, and he doesn't rise, then I don't know another word that you would call for it. Further, Paul and his disciples are all liars, or else they were deceived. And the one way to end Christianity once and for all is to produce the body of the Nazarene carpenter. That's interesting. That's an important aspect, because when we look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then also John, although John looks at it from a bit of a different angle, when Christ comes and he dies and then he's resurrected, and the Jews say, no, someone stole his body. They didn't say, they admitted that his body was gone. They backed themselves, they sort of pigeonhole themselves into that spot where they said, yeah, the body is gone. So even they were admitting the body is gone. Obviously, they were coming up with an excuse as to why it was gone. But it's important to realize that no one was arguing that the body was there and then 3 days later it was gone. So let's talk about some of the basic facts of the resurrection. From a historical study, we're going to talk about delivering some factually based claims that the vast majority of historical scholars, agree upon, and we're going to support some claims with good historical evidence and reason. Aren't you excited? School's not even started till next week, and we already get to dig into this stuff. That's cool. And we're going to talk about some relevant sources, some responsible methods, and some restrained results to help us vindicate the claims that we're going to make. So let's talk about that. Jesus was murdered and buried. Fact number 1. 3 days later, or afterward, his body went missing. No one disputes this. His body went missing. There were appearances of Jesus over the course of many days to various people, including his disciples and unbelievers. And Christ's appearances transformed his followers and some previous skeptics with his resurrection, becoming the central focus of their teaching. Remember, Paul has an experience with Christ on the road to Damascus, and then he leaves, and then he goes off into the wilderness, or goes off to Arabia for about 3 years, and then afterwards he comes back to Jerusalem to talk to Peter, and he says to Peter, listen, and he talks to the other disciples, this is what I'm telling everybody happened, because this is what I got from God. Is that what you guys are telling everybody happened? And yeah, that's what we're telling everybody happened. And there was agreement in what their message was, but not because Paul got it from Peter. Paul had this from the Lord, and then he came and confirmed it with Peter later on. We can chat about that later on, but I'm not sure if it's going to come up here. Just a side note. So these 4 facts about Jesus' resurrection are agreed to, etc., by the vast majority of historians, Christian and non-Christian. What evidence exists to support them? Well, there's a lot. Let's talk about it. Bart Ehrman, not a Christian at all. He wrote a book actually called, what was he called? Oh, it's like magnifying the preacher from Galilee or something like that, like how Jesus how Jesus became a god, and a few others. So not exactly a friend of this position, but he says this: one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. It's just history. So did Jesus die, and was he buried? Jesus' death and burial is recorded in all the gospel accounts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I know that when you start talking about these things, a lot of people are going to say, listen, Matthew and Luke are fantastic, but they're copied off of Mark. We can discuss that later. It looks like that's actually not the case. And then John, that he's copying much later in his time. Again, he's coming at it from a different angle, probably writing a little bit later on than the other Gospels, but still eyewitness accounts. And Jesus' death under Pilate is referred to in several extra biblical writings. Josephus is talking about it. There's a few others, Roman historians right around the 1st and 2nd century that are talking about it as well. And the burial of Joseph of Arimathea in his tomb is nearly universally held. Now, pause there for a second. What's interesting is that Joseph of Arimathea, he's part of the Sanhedrin, or he's a Pharisee. Pharisee or Sanhedrin? One of the two. Anyways, he's an important guy in the Jewish circle, in the Jewish elite. And his interactions with Christ, although they're recorded in the gospel, I believe his place in the Sanhedrin or in the Pharisaical community has also been found in extra biblical content as well, which I find that's really interesting. It just continues to corroborate with what the gospel writers are saying. So the tomb would be known to all the living in Jerusalem. Jesus' burial was witnessed by close friends. That's important. You know who your friends are. You're not going to have a mistaken identity. You know, Shannon's going in a tomb saying hey David, you're going to come over here. I'm going to be like, well, maybe it was, maybe it's not. You know who the people are that you're friends with or you close relationships with, and this is who these people were. They were his friends. They were his family, and his tomb was guarded by soldiers. That's important. For a Roman soldier to let a captive go, I'm not talking about Jesus for a second. Let's just back it up here and say, you're a Roman soldier and your job is to guard someone from escape, and they escape. It's life for life. That's how it works. Your job was to make sure they didn't escape. They escaped. It's your fault. You're going to die. That's Rome. There was nothing else. And I'm sure this would have happened routinely. So he was being guarded by Roman soldiers who would have been killed if they let Jesus escape. And by the way, the Romans were experts at killing. I mean, that's pretty much their full-time job and their pastime. They knew what they were doing. And continuing on here, Jews never denied that Jesus was dead and buried. That's very interesting. If you go back into rabbinical writings, you're going to go back into the Talmud, or you're going to go back into other places or historical references, etc. No one's disputing this. This is universally held. No one would argue that Jesus was never dead or buried. Mr. Crossan says that he, Jesus, was crucified is as sure as anything historical ever can be. It happened. Did Jesus' body go missing after his death? Let's talk about that for a minute. Jesus' body has never been found up to this day. That's important. A lot of other people's bodies have been found. Empty tomb, first viewed and reported by a group of Jesus' female followers, women followers, Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, etc. That's also interesting because back then you needed to have at least two, maybe three women to be able to corroborate something in terms of a court case. So, like, let's say you saw something happen. You saw a murder, you saw something else, you're the only woman there, and it's your job to go testify. You can't. There's a few cases. There was like 2 cases in rabbinical tradition where you could testify, but mostly, for most things, by and large, you couldn't do it. The word was just not held to the same level of authenticity at that time. And so to talk about Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, being the ones to, first of all, see Jesus is actually, if you think about it in that context, it's actually, you can't make this stuff up. You know, if you were going to make this stuff up after it happened, you wouldn't have it. You'd have like Peter finding him, and you'd have like someone else, maybe James and John finding him, you know, the 3 great apostles. You're not going to have Mary Magdalene and somebody else finding Christ after the resurrection. So, as we talked about, Peter and John later reported the tomb was empty, and Jewish leaders devised a lie to cover up the resurrection. By the way, that's still populated through Jewish circles today. They never refuted the claim that the body was gone, non-Christian historians, etc. So we're going to move on here. All the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some of their own ground, that other than scientific history. So Jesus was publicly executed in Jerusalem. His appearances took place there, and his resurrection was proclaimed there. If the body had still been found in the tomb, it would have been very easy to stop Christianity's message. Bring out the body. I mean, the Jews were the ones that said, like, we want to have Jesus put into this tomb, and then we're going to pay you to have extra Romans guard it. And if they wanted to, they could have said, okay, there's this lie going on, that Jesus is still around, etc. Let's bring it out. Let's falsify it right now. It would have collapsed. So, just in case you wanted some fun, detailed information, because everyone wants that on the Saturday evening of a long weekend, okay? Did the disciples and Paul experience Jesus? I'm not going to read through all of these for you, but you can have a quick glance and see these are some of the people that saw Christ. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just actually a fairly narrow list in terms of scope. Okay, so there's a lot of these. Now, I'm giving you references through here that are biblical. You're going to see Mark and John, etc. And that's fine because the Gospels are looking at it from a historical perspective, but there's also corroboration from outside sources as well. So, it's historically certain that Peter and the other disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Now, a lot of people have experiences. You know, we could probably go to a jail right now or to some psychological institution, right? And a lot of people would have some experiences. They would, are you Jesus Christ? You know, maybe we could find 50 people that think they are. But what does that mean? That means absolutely nothing if they can't back it up. So we're talking here a little bit different context than that, okay? We're going to talk about that argument coming in just a little bit. Why then did some of the disciples claim to see Jesus alive after his crucifixion? I don't doubt at all, I don't doubt that some of the disciples claim that Paul, writing about this 25 years later, indicates that this is what they claimed. And I don't think he's making it up. And he knew at least a couple of them, whom he met just 3 years after the event. Remember I mentioned Paul gets this from the Lord. He goes off to Arabia. He comes back up, and then he's talking about this afterward, 3 years later. Interesting. Paul got this from the Lord. He didn't get this from the disciples. So, what happened to Jesus' followers after his death? I think it'd be very interesting to say that they went the way they did in terms of their faith and their life if they knew that what they were believing in was completely nonsensical or it was a lie, to put it quite frankly. I don't think they would have gone through the excruciating life they did, but we're going to talk about that here. The New Testament records the embarrassing details of Jesus' disciples abandoning him and fled during his arrest. Remember Peter? Remember Peter, the great apostle, right? The top-tier guy who Paul's going to come and speak to. Christ is crucified. Well, let's back the story up. He's like, no, Lord, I'm not going to let anyone crucify you. And then he's like, no, I got to be crucified. And he goes to be crucified. And they're in the garden. And then he decides to take off the high priest's servant's ear. Remember that? Then the Lord takes the ear and he puts it back on and says, this is not what you're going to do. And then he gets crucified. And then Peter says, I'll never abandon you. I'll never abandon you. And then he abandons him 3 times, just like the Lord said he was going to do. He said, no, I never knew him. No, I never knew him. No, I never knew him. Interesting. Who would say that about themselves? Who would write that about themselves if they were writing a biography? They want to put, unless you're writing an autobiography of the most embarrassing details of your life, so 2,000 years later, people can read about one big mess up you had. And then it's also interesting that Peter goes on to write some really great books later in his life, talking about keeping the faith and how we should always be ready to give a reason. Remember how he says in 1 Peter 3:15, that's how I have apologetics. Always be ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within you with meekness and in fear. Always be ready to give a reason. He didn't have a reason for the girl that asked him if he was with Jesus. Maybe he learned something there. Anyways, that's an embarrassing detail. And the writer of Acts records how these same disciples stood before the exact same leaders who murdered Jesus, Ananias and Caiaphas, after his death and proclaimed Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Various accounts record that the disciples and Paul were martyred for their proclamation that Jesus was alive. One of the first people that got was Stephen. And Stephen, in his martyrdom, in his speech there, he goes through in the book of Acts, and he starts at the beginning, and he goes through whole chronological order of Christ's life, from the life of Israel, and then talks about the Messiah coming and how he died, and God has raised him back up. And Peter, when he speaks at Pentecost, he says, to all these people, that this guy died, was buried, and that the Lord raised him back up. And what does it say? 3,000 people were added to the church. They all knew that this thing had happened. There's no way Peter would have been able to make that claim if these people thought it was absolutely ridiculous. Even the rumors of Christ's resurrection were beginning to spread within the Roman Empire and especially within the Jewish culture itself. By the way, you don't pay money to cover up something and have people lie for you if you think that the thing that never happened in the first place. Right? Remember the Jews? They said, we're going to pay you some money. Just relax here. Everyone just calm it down. Here's the money. This is the story. Everybody on the same page? Good. That's the story. Okay? You don't do that if you think that what's being said never took place. Okay? So, let's talk about Mr. Witherington III. On any showing, the crucifixion should have put an end to the Jesus movement once and for all, and an honor and shame culture like early Judaism. It should have just been a dead issue. It should have been over with. Tertullian from 200 AD. At Rome, Nero was the first who stained with the blood of the rising faith. Then is Peter, gripped by another, when he is made fast to the cross. So Peter is being crucified to a cross, according to Tertullian. Okay, so depends how much weight you want to put in this guy. But anyways, this is what he's saying. Nevertheless, why would you get crucified if you thought it was a lie? Now, Some people can go to their death believing in a wrong philosophy, or they believe that a philosophy that they were thought to be true was not true. Like look at Russia, for instance, like the Soviet reunion. Like a lot of people died for a philosophy that they really believed in, right? Or people from the West, we believed in a philosophy that we really believed in, and we went to war and we fought against the Nazis. Like we believed in what we believed in the right thing to do. However, that's not the case with this. They're not believing in a philosophy. They're believing in that a guy actually rose from the dead and they've seen him. And Thomas put his hands through him. That's what they're dying for. That's what they're believing. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What happened to some of the skeptics after Jesus' death? For not even his brothers were believing in him. John 7:5. In that first century, it was embarrassing for a rabbi to have his family not be his followers. That's interesting because I don't know if you'll recall with me, but remember Christ says a prophet is not without honor except in his own home. And then he says, okay, I got to go somewhere else. Who do you think his biggest skeptics would have been? His family. Like if I went home right now and told my parents that I was the Messiah, there would be a serious conversation. You know? Your biggest skeptics, the people that are usually going to put you, because they have your best interest typically at heart, but they want to make sure you're doing a good job. They're not going to be like, oh, that's really good, David. Congratulations, you're Messiah? That's awesome. Good for you. Okay? They'd be like, no, you know what? Maybe that's not the good story. Maybe we'll come up with another story. How about you go work for the Navy? How's that? Okay? So, 1 Corinthians 15:7. He appeared to James. James was his brother. Okay? James was like the hardest guy to convince. James wasn't going around like believing Christ was Messiah. He didn't believe it. Especially not before the resurrection. It took a long time. So Festus was now dead, and that guy was but upon the raid. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. James was stoned because he really believed that Christ was raised from the dead. Let's look at one other guy, Eusebius. And I'm going to try and read this, but it's a little challenging. What do we need to say concerning Paul, who preached the gospel of Christ from Jerusalem to Icarium, and afterwards suffered martyrdom in Rome under Nero? These facts are related by Origen in the 3rd volume of his commentary on Genesis. You have thus, by such an admonition, bound together the planting of Peter and Paul at Rome and Corinth. For both of them planted and likewise taught us in our Corinth, and they taught together in like manner in Italy and suffered martyrdom at the same time. I've quoted these things in order that the truth of the history might still be confirmed. Okay, interesting. Peter and Paul dead because they believed the same thing. Starting to see a pattern here. People believe it, they see Christ come, and they're willing to actually die because they've seen it. Like, at some point you have to go, either they're insane, that's a possibility, we'll talk about that, or they actually seen this happen. So let's talk about some of the facts here. Jesus was murdered and buried 3 days afterward. His body went missing. There were appearances of Jesus all over the course of many days to various people, including his disciples and unbelievers. And Christ's appearances transformed his followers and some previous skeptics, with his resurrection becoming the central focus of their teaching. Probably the biggest person, if we can think of one that this is relating to. I mean, yes, we can think about Peter, because Peter had a life transformation when he saw Jesus again. He didn't have the same appearances like Paul did. But I think if you think about biggest 180 switch in someone's life, you have to think Paul. I mean, his job was to kill Christians and round them up, and he was very good at it. That's why he kept going from this place to all around the different cities, rounding them up. So he was good at it. And you think about that. Then Paul meets Christ and he goes, okay, I'm going to change my mind. And try and find a pastoral epistle from Paul where he's not talking about the resurrection. It's everywhere. If Christ be not raised, then you're dead in your sins, Corinthians, and by the grace of God, and blah, 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 And somewhere in there's going to be the resurrection. He doesn't have he doesn't write really that much without talking about the resurrection. So let's talk about the foundation for some of the undisputed facts. Multiple independent early sources support the facts. This is also by enemies of Christianity. They're supporting these facts, and we have embarrassing admissions that support the facts. Eyewitness and early testimony. Embarrassing, eyewitness, and early testimony. Let me go back one second. Embarrassing, women finding him at the tomb. Okay, not so embarrassing in 2016. Really embarrassing in 33 AD. You wouldn't just make this stuff up. Eyewitness testimony. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. And we have early testimony that support the facts. There's some debate in terms of when the Gospels were actually written, but they were written within a lifetime of Jesus' ministry. They were written no later than 85 to 90 AD. No way they were written any later than that. I would say that they were actually written probably a lot earlier, but we can say that. In terms of what that looks like for history, Alexander the Great, everything he did in was it 3 something BC, and his historian that's writing about him was about 380. That's close to 600 years between the time of what happened with Alexander and what was written about Alexander. What happened with Muhammad, everything that was written down happened about 150 to 200 years afterwards. There's nothing in the ancient world that actually comes this close in terms of what happened and what was written down. It's completely unique. So let's explain some of the facts surrounding the resurrection. And we're going to appeal to the best explanation. That's what we do. That's what history is. I like this. Do you like this? Explanation. I demand one. Demand an explanation. So we're going to examine the resurrection hypothesis with blah, blah, blah. Philosophical appeal to the best explanation approach. All that means is, did it probably happen? Yes. Okay? Also called the cumulative case or abductive argumentation case, whatever. All that means is there's more evidence for it than against it, okay? History. So, explanatory power, explanation, explanatory scope not being ad hoc, plausibility not contradicting accepted beliefs. These are questions we ask ourselves. These are questions you should ask yourself too when you're examining things, not just Christ, but other things as well. Let's keep moving on here because we don't need to turn this into a history class. So some of the common resurrection hypotheses. These are common. These are going to be in your National Geographic on an article on Jesus, or maybe Time, or maybe you're going to watch a documentary and there's going to be someone that's probably going to have an opinion that's based on one of these things. That's why I'm bringing them up, because these are things that you're going to see. Okay? Legend, hallucination, stolen body, wrong tomb, swan theory, spiritual only, mistaken identity, act of God. Those are your options, okay? It's kind of like Welcome to Baskin and Robbins, right? 31 choices. Which one do you want? This is pretty much the same sort of deal here, because all of them we're gonna poke a few holes in each one of them here, but those are most commonly the ones that we're talking about these days. Let's start by looking at the legend hypothesis, right? And we're going to summarize some of these. But the early dating of the Gospels ensures that they were written during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses who could refute legends. You see, legends usually have to have some time before they come into effect. In other words, if it's a legend, if it's a late addition, it would have been after the apostles being present to be able to refute it. So most people are saying the Gospels were written within the 1st century, like I just mentioned. And then historians demonstrate that it takes at least 2 generations to pass for an event to become legend, or can even account, or corrupt an account, I should say. So if you go back in the Greek legends, you're talking about Zeus, or you're talking about some of their mythological deities, if you will, or whatever the title you want to put on them, or you talk about the Norse gods from Scandinavia, etc. It usually takes some time for them to turn into legend. And we're going to skip past this a little bit, and we're going to just say that was the legend, okay? Cool. Let's move on. Hallucination hypothesis. This is one that's probably the most common today, so let's just pause here for a moment. It's currently the number one explanation given by skeptics. So it doesn't really explain the tomb, the empty tomb, I should say, and the body still missing. Hallucinations are generally experienced by people wanting to see something. The gospel accounts all confirm the disciples did not expect to see Jesus from the resurrected, or being resurrected. So actually there is a placebo effect. Doctors have noticed this. It's like, I was reading about it today in The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, but he was interviewing one of the top psychologists in the US and asking a little bit about it. And anyways, it's and pretty much get better by suggestion. Okay, yeah, it happens a little bit, but that's not what we're talking about here. Peter wasn't like, after the resurrection, Peter wasn't like looking for Jesus. Remember what happened? They all left. They're like on the road to Emmaus. Well, and Christ shows up to them and they said, well, haven't you been in Jerusalem? We thought this guy Jesus was the Messiah, but I guess he wasn't. And they all started to leave and started to go do their own thing. They weren't looking to be, put into some hallucinogenic state where they would, see Christ. So not just one, but multiple times. Not just to one person, but to different people. Not just individuals, but to groups of individuals. Not at one location, but multiple locations. Multiple circumstances. And unbelievers, skeptics, and even enemies also saw Christ. So we're going to talk now a little bit about the stolen body hypothesis. Okay? Can't explain the transformed lives of the disciples. Right? Why would Peter go from being, I don't know him, I don't know him, I don't know him, I'm going to leave and do my own thing, to I'm going to go to Rome, I'm going to go to here, I'm going to go start a church over here, and then I'm going to die because I think it was made up. Can't explain the transformation. The skeptics James and Paul in their conversion was based on appearance. And no one dies for what they know to be false. For what they know to be false. People can die for something that is false. But unless I would suggest you're completely mad, you don't die for something that you know is false. A lot of people die for things that are false all the time. But they don't think that what they're dying for is false. That's the difference. Empty tomb on its own would not convince many. New Testament, okay, we'll just skip through some of this. And wrong tomb hypothesis. Okay, this is the wrong tomb hypothesis. They thought it was the wrong tomb, okay? Cool. We're going to keep going here. We don't have all day. Apparent death hypothesis. Jesus was scourged to the point where he was completely disfigured. Death recorded in all 4 Gospels. So this, by the way, this hypothesis, this is theory that a lot of people are throwing out, that a lot of your friends and your colleagues and people that will, read a magazine instead of the Gospels will put at you, that it was made to appear that he died. You remember, what's a really popular religious text that would say it made it look like Christ died, but he didn't actually die? The Quran. The Quran says it made it look like he was going to die, but he didn't actually die. By the way, the Romans knew when someone was dead. They were good at this. This was their job, killing people, and they weren't going to make a mistake. So let's talk about that. The death viewed in close eyewitnesses. Roman soldiers did not allow their victims to live. Remember when they came to Christ and they said, he's already dead. He's on their cross. He's already dead. We don't need to break his legs like we break everyone else's legs so they're going to die on the cross, because that's what you do. You put them on the cross, and then once they're getting to the point where they're going to die, you break their legs so all the body weight comes down and they're going to suffocate, or whatever the technical medical term is going to be for it. But they came to Christ and said he's already dead. I don't think the Romans got it wrong. I'm sure they knew a dead person when they saw one. And the spear wound described in John 19:34-35 tells of rupturing the whatever that word is, okay? That's cool. Anyone can pronounce that? Sweet, thank you. Jesus would have to revive in the tomb. I don't know. Push back the stone, overpower the Roman guards, and then appear as followers and skeptics. Just after coming off a cross and all that. And then worship, described by disciples, would have been unlikely if Jesus was crippling and greatly wounded state. And he was seen in glorious form by Paul, okay? So spiritual-only hypothesis. The gospel accounts record that the disciples disbelieved even on Easter morning. It was the physical appearance of Christ that transformed their lives. They saw him. Thomas said, unless I put my hand through you, I'm not going to believe. Christ said, okay, come here. Right there. Okay? Thomas doubted the resurrection and only believed once he touched Christ. Christ took food and ate in their presence, and James was converted by a physical encounter with Jesus. James is his brother. James is like, okay, well, you were dead and you're alive. And I'm going to believe that. Mistaken identity, twin hypothesis. Okay, this hypothesis says that there was another twin. There is like a Jesus 2.0, okay? There is, and I don't really know, enough said. Act of God, resurrection hypothesis. Let's talk about that one. I think that's one where we should probably put a little bit of merit. Jesus predicted his death and resurrection multiple times in the presence of believers and skeptics. Facts of resurrection are present in all gospel accounts, and they're written during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. It offers the best explanation for the empty tomb, the appearance stories, the transformation of the disciples and skeptics, and the growth of Christianity in the first century. It spread. It went everywhere. And everyone that's a historian is going like, I don't know how this happened. A guy died, and then everyone dies for believing that he's alive, and then it just goes everywhere. And that's why we get Christ as our mediator, and that's why we have a living hope, and that's why we have Christianity, and that's why we're really here tonight. It's because he rose, right? N.T. Wright. The proposal that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead proposes unrivaled power to explain the historical data of the heart of Christianity. In other words, what he's trying to say, because Mr. Wright has a hard way of saying things very straightforward. I don't know if you've ever watched him on TV. It happened. Okay? The best explanation is it happened. So, the primary reason this option is rejected by critics is because, following their anti-supernatural bias, they rule God out in a priori manner. In other words, they find what they're looking for. You find what you're looking for, and they find what they're looking for. And I think they do discredit to the ability to be open to the evidence that's at large, but it's not a review of the evidence, but rather a commitment to naturalism that causes skeptics of the resurrection to exclude the resurrection hypothesis. In other words, like I mentioned, they find what they're looking for. So, here's the three. We're going to wrap it up right after this. Psychological. The disciples and others imagined a risen Christ, changed from unbelieving cowards into courageous evangelists, and went to their deaths for being deceived or for something they knew to be untrue. Biological. Jesus survived the beatings, scourging cross, and spear thrust into his heart, fooled his executioners, recuperated in the tomb, rolled away the stone, and had his resurrection falsely proclaimed. Or, we have this option. Christ's resurrection was a true, historically valid, and divine miracle, where Jesus died and came back to life 3 days later, which is in keeping with the theme of miracles in the Gospels. Let me wrap things up here. I'm pretty sure we're close to the end. Thomas Arnold is saying, I've been used for many years to study the histories of other times and to examine and weigh the evidence of those who have written about them. And I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of any sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer that the great sign which God hath given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead. Conclusions. God and his miracles are affirmed. Historical Jesus of Nazareth is pronounced the divine Son of God. C.S. Lewis said, but if we admit God, we must admit miracle. Indeed, you have no security against it. That's the bargain. If you have a God, you can have the possibility for a miracle. We believe there is a God. We believe that he intervenes in history and that this is definitely the monumental time when which he did that. We're going to bridge the gap now between history and faith. So the resurrection, I'm going to just go to that second point there. The resurrection provides the evidence and means to bridge the gap between history and faith. Okay? History and faith. History on the left, That's what we believe on the right. We believe on the right because it's based on what's on the left. And it points in that direction. And this is just a quick synopsis, but there's more reasoning for that. But that's just born in Bethlehem, he was a Jewish rabbi, performed great feats, arrested for his teaching, crucified under Pilate, body went missing, great moral teacher. No one will dispute that. Was he born of a virgin? Yeah, some might dispute that. Sent from God? Yeah, maybe. But it comes out of that, and then it's attested to by the Gospels themselves. So 1 Corinthians 15:20. This is good news, guys. But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. That's why when we do have those times where we see loved ones that pass, or we experience loss, and we see, we're at a graveside, we do so. We have a living hope. We can sing in all integrity and with correct theology. We can sing, your presence, Lord, because it's not like a mental state, it's his presence because he's alive. And we can sing other wonderful truths, and we can have that assurance that Christ said, I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come back, bring you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also, right? Those are all part of the resurrection. And so Paul says that he is risen, has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. So this evening, that really is wrapping things up in terms of this series. And it wraps things up for us this evening for the resurrection. And there's much more we could go into it. We can't go into all of it. There's so many cool things, and there's if you have a chance, if you get a book called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, that's fantastic. I'm reading that right now. It's a great work. It goes into much more detail, but the bottom line is this. When you start your Gospels, when you pick up your Bible, the whole point is simply this. You can trust your Bible. Christ died. According to the Scriptures, he was buried, and that 3 days later he rose. And that's why we have Christianity. That's why we have a faith. Our faith is in the risen Lord. Just like it is for Paul, or was for Paul, like it was for Peter, like it was for all the disciples. And I think that maybe more so than a belief in God, or more so about talking about subjective morality, etc., the fact that Jesus Christ rose from the grave is extremely important, extremely crucial. And not to minimize it, but it's extremely beneficial as well for you and I this evening.